Good evening and welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County's program, The Latin American Response to the Holocaust, the Examples of the Dominican Republic and Mexico. My name is Thorin Tritter. I am the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. I want to welcome you to our program. This is actually the first of two programs that the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center is holding to honor National Hispanic Heritage Month. And we're delighted to have as our co-sponsors the Nassau County Office of Hispanic Affairs, the NAACP's Freeport Roosevelt branch, and La Fuerza Unida, a community service organization that serves the communities in Nassau County, but it's based in Glen Cove. Before I talk about tonight's program, I did want to take the opportunity to put in a plug for a couple of our other upcoming programs. Next Wednesday, October 7th at 11 a.m., I'll be leading my next Curator's Corner program. Those are short weekly programs I do where I focus on a particular object in our collection and talk about it while our building is closed to the public. Next week, I'm going to be talking about a photograph of the Nuremberg trials that we have in our museum. Although I think the trials are pretty well known, the photograph's a window into a more complicated history than I think most people realize. So perhaps you'll be able to join me for that. And the second program I wanted to mention is our second program in honor of National Hispanic Heritage Month, which will be a film program next Thursday, October 8th at 7:30 p.m., when we will screen a documentary. It's about a 40-minute documentary about the Delano grape strike of the 1960s and 70s and the work of Cesar Chavez. A post-screening discussion is going to be led by local community activist Nelson Melgar. So again, I hope you'll be able to join us for that. And you can find the details for those programs and all our full schedule of virtual programs on our website at www.hmtcli.org. Okay, so let's talk about tonight's program. And before I introduce our speaker, let me mention that we will set aside some time at the end for Q&A. So please use the Q&A feature of Zoom by scrolling your mouse over the top or bottom of the screen, depending on your device. Find the Q&A button and then type in your questions. If you type them in during the program, we will make sure to get time for our speaker to address those questions at the end. Or you can, of course, pose them at the end. But I hope that as things come up, you'll pose them and we'll be able to make this an interactive experience at the end of the program. Okay, this evening, and I'm just going to stop sharing my screen here so that we can see each other a little better. And we can see our speaker, delicious. This evening, we are honored to have with us Christina Chavarria, who joins us from the William Levine Family Institute for Holocaust Education at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Ms. Chavarria has worked at USHMM for 16 years in various capacities, but currently runs the Conference for Holocaust Education Centers, a program that builds cooperation and cooperative relationships with Holocaust organizations throughout the United States. Before joining the USHMM, Ms. Chavarria was the Director of Education at Holocaust Museum Houston for more than 6 years. Tonight, she draws from her extensive educational experience and her own particular research interest in the impact and history of the Holocaust in the Ibero-American world of Spain, Portugal, and Latin America. So, without further ado, Christina, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to hearing about the Latin American response to the Holocaust and the examples in the Dominican Republic and Mexico. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that very gracious introduction and for the gracious invitation to join you this evening. I want to thank Dr. Tritter and also Helen Turner, one of his colleagues, for inviting me to share the evening with you. And I want to thank all of you as well for joining in. I know sometimes after work, we just want to go home and we want to relax. But in this pandemic, one of the silver linings is that we can do a lot of things from home now. So thank you so much to everyone who has joined us, especially in this month that is very important for the Hispanic community, but it's also for everyone as well. Everyone to learn about histories and how they intersect. So I'm going to share the screen with you so that you can see the PowerPoint and some visuals that we have for this discussion. And as Dr. Truder said, if you would be sure to write your questions and your comments in the chat, that would be great. So if you haven't visited the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, you know that we have you would know either by looking online or if you have visited, I should say, you know we have a very extensive exhibition. But we also have so much happening behind the scenes. And one of the things that we have is the mission to collect evidence of the Holocaust. And we call this rescuing the evidence of the Holocaust. And what we do is we accept collections, artifacts, papers from individuals all the way up through working with individual countries for them to open their records to us during the Holocaust era, during the Nazi era. And we have a large project to collect archives and records from the Americas, from south of the Rio Grande. And that's what we will see tonight. And it's from there that I was able to research many countries in Latin America and their responses to the growing Nazi threat, to what is happening in Europe. So right here in this opening slide, you do see two photos that reference the Americas. The one on your right-hand side, my right-hand side anyway, with the cow is from the Dominican Republic. And the other one is a boat called the Kwanzaa that was actually refused entry into Veracruz, Mexico in 1940. And I'll talk a little bit about those in a short while. But the museum itself is located on the National Mall, and there is a reason for that. We want to look at how and why the Holocaust happened. And in doing so, we have to look even at our own responses, the US responses to what was happening in Europe at that time. We are located on the National Mall, as you can see, with the Washington Monument in the background. It's virtually across the street from us. And we are on the National Mall because we want to be a reminder to our visitors that democracy is fragile, and the Holocaust is definitely a case study in which you realize how fragile a democracy can be and how easy it can be to slip into a dictatorship, which is what we see happen in Nazi Germany with the rise of the Nazi Party. So we're this constant reminder, even when you're walking amongst all of the memorials to American democracy, we want to remind visitors in Washington that we must be forever vigilant to uphold democratic principles in our own country. One of the big questions that we receive from visitors and that teachers often get from students is, why didn't European Jews leave the continent and go elsewhere? Why did they stay? And we're going to examine that a little through the two countries that we're looking at. Right now we have an exhibit at the museum, which unfortunately is temporarily closed due to the pandemic, but you can go online and you can see this exhibit online. It's called Americans in the Holocaust. And what this exhibit does is that it examines the situation in Europe, but it also looks at the United States, and it looks at our attitudes toward immigration, how those are influenced by the Depression and also by the outcome of the First World War. And then we look at different debates that are happening in the United States with regard to immigration. Should we let refugees into our country? And then we look at the debate on entering the war, which then of course we do enter. And we start to look at immigration through the lens of fears for national security. But what we also do is we look at global responses. And actually that's how we started the museum, by really looking globally at who would help refugees. So we're going to start this evening because there's so much history to cover, but we're going to keep it short, but really to the point. We're going to start with the Evian Conference in July of 1938. So by this time, the Nazi Party has been in power. Hitler has been in power for 5 years, and the situation is becoming increasingly worse, especially as he is expanding the territory of the Third Reich. Austria has now become part of the Third Reich and also parts of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. And we start to see an increase in visas. So yes, definitely European Jews at this time, German and Austrian Jews primarily, are starting to realize that the situation will not get better and that they must leave. And so you see an increase in visa applications to go anywhere almost. And this illustration that appeared in the New York Times on July 3rd, 1938, is really getting to the heart of this. So there is a conference that is held in Evian, France. It's actually convened by President Roosevelt, who he himself does not attend, nor does anyone from his cabinet. 32 countries send representatives to the Evian Conference to look at the growing refugee crisis and to determine if they will take in refugees beyond the quotas that their countries have. And this is where the Dominican Republic really makes its appearance in this history. Out of the 32 nations that send representatives, it is only the Dominican Republic that steps forward and says that they will take up to 100,000 Jewish refugees and accept them into the Dominican Republic. Rafael Trujillo is the dictator of the Dominican Republic at that time. He does not attend, but he sends his son Virgilio, and Virgilio actually addresses the whole congregation there at the conference, reading this dramatic letter about how they want to extend charity to European Jews. But what is really behind that is what we want to look at. Trujillo needed to rehabilitate his image. He had overseen and ordered the massacre of thousands of Haitians the year before in 1937. There had been a great international outcry against him. So this is his way of trying to put himself in a humanitarian light, which we know from the broader history of his rule, which is not true. But what happens with the Dominican Republic is that the Dominican Republic does start to issue visas, but at the same time, it's donating land to settle some of the refugees who will be coming over from Germany and Austria. But there are challenges to that. The vast majority of refugees do not have agricultural experience. And if you're familiar with the Dominican Republic, especially at that time, it was very agricultural, it was tropical, and most of the refugees who are coming come from big cities like Berlin, Vienna. They are white collar workers, they're not experienced in settling land, in any type of agricultural work, so they need training. So an organization is formed by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the Joint as it is called. It's called DORSA, and DORSA stands for the Dominican Republic Settlement Association. So the Joint Distribution Committee, which has its base here in the United States, through the support of President Roosevelt, put forth funding to help to establish Sosua, which was land that was donated by Trujillo, to establish this colony, basically, this agricultural colony of German and Austrian Jewish refugees from Europe. So this is a picture where you see some of the members of DORSA. They're primarily from the American Jewish community, and they're working with the local Dominican population to help to establish this so that refugees can come over. It's on the northern coast, and it is supported by different Jewish relief agencies here in the United States with the backing of President Roosevelt. So as we move forward here, I'm going to focus on one family in particular and how their story intersects with the Dominican Republic. And this family, the Blumenstein family, they're from Vienna, they're Jewish. The father is Franz, the mother is Elsa, and Heinz is the little boy who's being held with his father. And here you see them, they're in Vienna. You can see a more of a city feel to this picture because it is in Vienna and a very cosmopolitan city. Some of you might be familiar with the Voyage of the St. Louis. So what happens is the father, Franz, is arrested, and after Kristallnacht, which is the pogrom, the destruction of Jewish synagogues and also Jewish homes and businesses in November 1938, he is arrested after that. He has to leave the country. He's released from Buchenwald, one of the concentration camps. He's released because he has to show he's going to leave the country. He first goes to Venezuela, and then he goes to Cuba because his sister is in Cuba. His wife and son are able to go with him because by that time they do not have enough money to purchase tickets for them to leave. But he has to leave because he's already been arrested once. But his wife and son are able to finally book passage on a boat called the St. Louis, which is a story that many people know because the St. Louis took over 900 Jewish refugees to Cuba, where they were going to wait until they could try to come to the United States. But when they arrived in Havana, they were not able to stay. The Cuban government refused to let them stay. And this is a picture of Elsa, his wife, on the left-hand side. And this is a newspaper article on the Voyage of the St. Louis. It appeared in many American newspapers. So the wife, Elsa, and the little boy, Heinz, have to go back to Europe. And they are given refuge in the Netherlands. And in the meantime, Franz, the father, is able to go to the Dominican Republic, and he is able to become active in Sosua. So here he is, and this is a very big contrast from what we see him. He owned a perfume factory in Vienna. He had no agricultural experience whatsoever. But because of the funding that was put into bringing refugees over, he was able to go to the Dominican Republic. And the reason why he went to the Dominican Republic is because he learned that the Dominican Republic was granting visas for refugees to come as a result of the Evian Conference. So here we see him in part of the banana plantation there. He's picking bananas on the left-hand side. And then we see him here out where he was going to work to till part of the land. So this is very different work. But I want to also mention the fact that because this work was very different for most of the refugees who wanted to go there, many were not allowed to go. They wanted agricultural workers, as we could see. The process to obtain visas was also very complicated and slow. And especially when the war begins, it really does slow down the process in late 1939. And again, I mentioned that the climate is very different from that of Germany or Austria. It's tropical, it's humid, many parts of it are unsettled. And cultivating the land for fertility is also even more difficult than they originally thought. And Sosua, as a project to bring in refugees, it almost fails in its first year in 1940, around the time these pictures are taken. Also, another thing to note is there really is no existing Jewish community in Sosua. In the Dominican Republic, there were maybe about 200 Jews in total, but in Sosua there was no Jewish community, which can make it hard when you're looking for a community to join and you're looking for a place to belong, that has the customs and the culture that you might be used to support your religious life. But they were able to build a small synagogue there in Sosua, and they were able to worship. But they did face many challenges there. And I also want to note at this time too, that it was largely because of the local community that Sosua was able to be successful. And here are some letters that we have in our collection. I'm going to just go back right here. You can't really see what it says, but what happens is Franz is he's working to acquire visas for his wife and his son to join him from the Netherlands, where they are now given refuge, to come over to join him in the Dominican Republic. And this first letter is from November of 1940 saying, yes, we're working on your visa applications for your wife and son. We look forward to having them come and join you. Here's a letter from the State Department assuring them that yes, he will receive the visas for them. They will be sent to them. But as things continue to progress toward the expansion of the war, tragically what happens is his wife and son being in the Netherlands is occupied by Germany in 1940, and they have to go into hiding because they're not Dutch citizens and they're Jewish. Tragically, the wife is discovered and she is arrested, she is sent to Auschwitz, and she does not survive. The little boy is taken into hiding by a Christian family, and he's hidden by them, and he's given a fake name, and he is able to survive. And he's reunited with his father in the United States after the war. And he lives in Silver Spring, Maryland, just about a mile north of where I am right now. And he donated this collection and these photos to the museum. So what happens with the Dominican Republic is, even though we had Trujillo claiming that he would take in 100,000 refugees, less than 5,000 visas were actually given to the refugees to go to the Dominican Republic. And we're not sure how many people exactly were able to get there. And in Sosua, you had less than 800 refugees who went there. But still, when you listen to their testimonies and their stories, they're very grateful that they had a place to go, even if it was difficult for them at first to adjust. So I just want to share with you some more photos from Sosua, and these are some more refugees. And if you look closely on the back of the cart that they're on, it says leche, of course, which is milk in Spanish, and they are delivering milk that they have milked from cows themselves. Again, very different from the kind of work that they were used to doing back in Germany and Austria. And just on a lighter note too, this is a school in 1945 in Sosua, La Escuela Cristóbal Colón, Christopher Columbus School. These are the children that were born to refugees in Sosua. And what is striking here is that mostly men went to Sosua. Most of the refugees who went there were men. Very few women went there at first. So many of the men ended up marrying local women. And if you look closely at this photo, you can see some children of mixed background. Sosua still exists today. There's a very tiny community. There is a museum there to Sosua and to this history. And we have worked with them. And we have also met descendants of the refugees who went to Sosua, who now live here in the United States, and they've donated these. In fact, this picture I showed at a conference many years ago, and it turns out that one of the children in the picture was at the conference because he heard about this, and he ended up sending us some more pictures of the children in his kindergarten class. But in the end, the Dominican Republic was not able to take in as many refugees because of the war. Our funds were diverted from supporting the settlement to supporting the war effort. And also it became much more dangerous with German U-boats and spy boats that were circling the Americas. it became a much more dangerous prospect for refugees to come over. So now I'm going to switch to the mainland of the Americas and to Mexico. And Mexico itself is a very different story because of the fact that we have to really look at the end of the Mexican Revolution. Mexico, after the end of the Mexican Revolution in 1920, it became a haven for people who were persecuted for their religious or political beliefs in Europe. And in 1924, Eastern European Jews were encouraged to immigrate to Mexico. It had a very open immigration policy. And it was also one of the first countries in 1934, a year after Germany is now in the hands of the Nazi Party. President Cárdenas, he politically announces his opposition to the racist policies of the Nazi regime. He was pretty outspoken against what he saw happening in Nazi Germany at that time. And also too, under his leadership, Mexico becomes a very strong supporter of Spanish Republicans who opposed Francisco Franco and his supporters, including Mussolini and Hitler, in the Spanish Civil War. So there's a lot of intersection that needs to be looked at more with the Spanish Civil War, because that was really the first fascist conflict that we see in Europe. And it was widely reported here in the United States, but we don't hear about it so much. And hopefully we will really look more and more at those intersections between the Spanish Civil War and the fascism in Spain, and how, of course, it spreads up through Germany under a different leader. But Mexico was a supporter of the Spanish Republicans and very much opposed to the Franco regime at that time. And so right here, this is a picture that you can see of the children of Spanish Republicans who were able to go to Mexico. Mexico made it a point to reach out to Spanish Republicans to come. And I'll talk a little bit more about that right now. But one of the key moments in Mexican history with regard to what is happening in Nazi Germany and the Third Reich is Mexico was the only country in the League of Nations that in November 1938 spoke out vehemently and wrote declarations, formal declarations, condemning the Third Reich, of the mass destruction in November 1938 of synagogues, Jewish-owned stores, Jewish property, and the arrest of Jewish males being sent to concentration camps for the first time as a group. Mexico was very outspoken about Kristallnacht. I want to mention too that Mexico was also probably the only left-leaning country in the Americas at that time. It was the only country that had democratic elections. Not to say that there were issues with that, but it was the only country that did have elections at the time. It was very left-leaning at the time. Many of the Spanish Republicans, for example, that it took in were of the Communist Party, for example. Mexico also did have a problem, though, with the extreme right-leaning Nazi party that was there in Mexico as well at the time. There was a group called the Gold Shirts that was the Nazi party there in Mexico that was opposed to Cárdenas. But it was also a time when Mexico was also carrying and upholding diplomatic relations with the Vichy government in France, which was part of the collaborationist government of the Nazi regime once Germany goes into France at that time. And that will help. But here I've included some posters condemning Nazi fascism here. And you can see this is a poster that came after Kristallnacht. This is in response to Kristallnacht. It was to warn people of the threat of Nazi spies. And that takes us to this history here. We're going to jump ahead a little because I know we're running out of time and we want to take questions. But Mexico does not enter the war right away. And in fact, many of the countries in Latin America were pretty much influenced by the United States and what the United States did. Not all of them, but Mexico, because of its diplomatic relations with the United States and of course its proximity, did not enter the war at the beginning in 1939. And of course, we know here in the United States, we did not enter the war until 1941, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Mexico, what happens there is there was a real propaganda battle for Mexico's loyalty between the Axis powers, Germany, Japan, Italy, and the Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, and England. And what happens is a boat, a German U-boat, torpedoes a Mexican boat there along the Pacific. And this raises a huge outcry among the Mexican community throughout the country. And that is when Mexico aligns itself with the Allied powers and cuts relationships with diplomatic relationships with Nazi Germany, but does uphold this relationship with the Vichy government in France. And what happens there with these documents that you see here, and one of them you saw earlier this evening, it was used in the opening slide, was going back and looking at the Spanish Civil War. Quite a few European Jews who were leaving Germany and Austria and going to other parts of Europe, quite a few of them went to Spain to fight alongside the Spanish Republicans against Franco. And some of them were able to come in with the group of Spanish Republicans to Mexico. That is how many of them were able to get to Mexico, because they came mixed in with the Spanish Republicans who were given refuge in Mexico. And one of the reasons why Mexico was very intent on helping Spanish Republicans come to Mexico was because Mexico itself had its own idea of nationalism. It wanted to build up its mestizo identity. It wanted people who were part of the Latin culture, who were fluent in Spanish, who understood Latin culture, which of course much of it we derived from Spain. So Spaniards would have an easier time of adjusting to life in Mexico because they know the language, and even if they no longer practice Catholicism, a lot of them, there was still that culture that they knew and they understood. By this time though, Mexico starts to close its doors to immigrants from Greece and from Eastern Europe and from Turkey and from China. So that the way that European Jews, especially those from Central and Eastern Europe, were able to come in was largely with the Spanish Republicans. And right here I'm gonna just show you this document right here. This is a document for immigration given to a German Jewish young man, 19 years old, Nicolas Bodek. And it's signed, you'll notice right here, there's a signature for Gilberto Vosquez. Gilberto Vosquez was a consul general. He was posted in Marseille, France, which was under the Vichy government. And from what we know, he issued up to 40,000 visas for refugees to go to Mexico. Many of them were Jewish. And he was also doing this, though, by this time, he was doing it without the permission of the Mexican government, and certainly without the permission of the German government. And for that, he was put under house arrest by the German government. He was put under house arrest for a year, he and his family and also his workers. And because the Mexican government still had diplomatic relations with the Vichy government, they were able to negotiate for his release. And this is a picture of Bosques arriving in Mexico City. And you can see he's being greeted by a very large crowd, and these are mostly refugees who he helped to save. He has not yet been recognized by Yad Vashem in Israel, but there is some debate about him, whether he took money or not, whether he asked for money from each of the people he was saving. But I just want to end on this note, and then we'll take some questions. This is testimony of a Holocaust survivor, Nellie Wolf, who lives in Mexico City. And we will end with just listening to her thoughts about going to Mexico.
There was this Mexican consul in Marseille called Gilberto Bosques. He used to be, I think he was a minister of the interior in the Cárdenas time in Mexico. And then he became a consul. And he had left this tendency, so he helped the socialists who were trying to leave and come into Mexico. He helped many Spaniards. Only a few years ago, there was a big meeting to inaugurate the bust that was made with the contribution of people who he helped to save. The bust is still there in the Trotsky Museum. You can go and see it if you like. So he lived up to the age of 103, I was told, and died only a few years ago, 1 or 2 years ago.
He was someone who helped a lot of Jews to leave France.
Not only Jews, he helped lots of Spaniards too. What I remember is that the Spaniards would go on the deck and sing and dance and whatever. And I just watched and say, my God, that's a language I had never heard. I'm going to speak that in Mexico.
What were you told about where you were going, and how did you feel about it?
Information was very scarce and misleading. We were told that there were Indians with arrows and bows and whatever. There was lots of oil and silver. Period. That was all the information we had about Mexico. And but we were told, of course, that Spanish was spoken here, and I just listened to those people and couldn't understand much. But I liked their dancing and their singing. They were much happier than the German-speaking people.
So I just want to stop there. That was Nellie Wolf. And the last clip, she's talking about being on the boat going from Europe to Mexico. And there are many Spanish Republicans on the boat with her. She was from Vienna. And so again, just that intersection between the Spanish conflict, the Spanish Civil War, intersecting with the conflict that grows out of Nazi Germany that becomes what we know as the Holocaust. So I just want to thank you all for listening. I will look now at the chat and
Thanks very
thank
much,
you.
Christina. That's super. I have so many questions in my head, and I know there are some questions coming up here. Let me pose just some that I know that you can see as well. But one person mentions, by the way, that they went to Sosua in the last couple of years, and they saw there was a museum in a synagogue there. I don't know if you said that there's obviously the descendants of the refugees who moved there, but it doesn't sound like there's much of a Jewish community there. Is that correct?
Not most of them left. Many of them came here to the US. Some went to Israel. It's a very small Jewish community. There were a few of the refugees who were still alive. I'm not sure if they are still alive today, but there were a handful. And yes, I can see the comment. The synagogue is now the museum.
Okay.
Yes.
And you can also see Debbie Cohn asked a question about Franz, and she just wanted some clarification about, he went to the Dominican Republic, but first he's on the boat to Cuba. Where was he going and how did he get around?
Sure. Okay. So what happens is his wife, Elsa, is able to get him out of Buchenwald, the concentration camp that he's sent to after he's arrested from Kristallnacht, because she's able to she's able to gather enough money to buy a ticket for him to leave the country, and to go on a boat called the Königstein to Venezuela. Actually, it's not supposed to go to Venezuela. It's supposed to go to Trinidad and Tobago, but it is refused entry there, and Venezuela takes them in. So he actually first goes to Venezuela, but his sister was able to go to Cuba, and so he goes to Cuba to be with his sister. And when he's in Cuba, Cuba lets him in by boat, and he's able to pull together enough money to purchase passage for his wife and son to sail on the St. Louis, which we know it's turned away, and he never sees them again. He actually is able to see them from the deck, and he goes out on a flotilla and he's able to talk to them. And we actually have a picture that he took. I didn't include it in this presentation, but I'll put up my email address and
That is heart-wrenching.
share it with you. And then from there, because he heard about Sosua, and after this horrible episode of his wife and son being turned away, he goes to Sosua because he knows that he hears that they would give visas to his wife and son, which they did. But tragically, they were not able to secure, by the time they were able to get the visas, they were not able to leave Europe. They could not get the exit visa.
Yeah. You know, I wanted to raise a question. Whenever I see material about the Evian Conference, the Dominican Republic often comes up as the only example of a country, or the only country that steps up and says we will take in these Jewish refugees. But it always comes almost with an asterisk about the motivations that Trujillo had. And
Yes.
I wondered if you could talk a little about that, and
Sure.
if that undercut, maybe that doesn't matter. You know, I mean, in the great scheme of things, the fact that he opened his doors is more important perhaps than his motivation. But anyway, I wanted to hear your thoughts.
You know, I think it really depends on who you ask. And I just want to make it clear that in no way do we want to put a positive light on him, because what he did to his own people was horrific. And he was assassinated in 1961. There is really no love for him there. He was himself a murderous dictator. And he did this, what he did was really motivated by trying to rehabilitate his image in the international community, because of the massacre of 20,000 Haitians that he ordered in 1937. You know, there was also this theory about him having racist views, which yes, he did, and that he wanted to bring in more Europeans to kind of Europeanize the Dominican Republic. I mean, he himself had those views. Those views, by the way, were very popular, and from the latter part of the 19th century, they were very popular here in the United States. You know, the views on eugenics, and that informed a lot of our immigration policies in the 1920s that would later on restrict who came here during the refugee crisis that begins in 1938. So everything is really connected here. Yeah,
yeah. And a confusing, I mean, a complicated story, right? I mean, there's
yes.
On the one hand, the motivations, on the other hand, the fact that he's opening the door. Now, did you mention that, maybe I misheard, but I thought you said something about American money being used by Trujillo to help
yes.
settle the refugees?
Yes, so when you look at this history, you have to look at the bigger history of the United States and Latin America, and looking at the good neighbor policy, and its influence. We don't want to increase our quotas, but we do put some effort into meeting with different leaders in Latin America to encourage them, and we will put forth some money, funding for them to support refugees who want to go there. So we had some influence in that. And it was through the Joint Distribution Committee. That was the major organization that gave money, that raised money and gave money to help establish and support SOSUA.
So America's got some confusing actions there. On the one hand, saying, no, we're not opening our borders more, we're not going to increase the quotas, but on the other hand, working kind of behind the scenes to encourage others to take some of those refugees.
Absolutely. And if you look at the story of James McDonald, who represented the United States at the Evian Conference and who went on to become our first ambassador to the State of Israel, he writes extensively about this in his papers, and we published those papers where he is going to the Americas starting in 1935. So I'm seeing some of the questions. There were other US funds as well, but it was mostly through the JDC, and they established DORSA, who I mentioned earlier. And hi, Helen, thank you so much. What books, articles, or researchers would you suggest to learn more about this topic? There are two very good books on the Dominican Republic. One of them is called Tropical Zion by Alan Wells. He is the son of a refugee who went to the Dominican Republic. And the other book is called Dominican Haven by Marian Kaplan, Dr. Marian Kaplan. She's at NYU. She's a preeminent German historian of this time period. And she's also written a book about Portugal during the Holocaust. For Mexico, I recommend the book, and oh my gosh, the name escapes me, but Daniela Gleiser is the author, Gleiser. And there's also another book called Mexico, La Patria. I forget the author's name. It's over in another room here at home. I have my books, but they're not right here next to me. But I can send the names to, I can send the titles to Helen, and then she can share them with everybody. And here, I'll put my email address right here in the chat.
Oh, thanks very much. I had also another question. I just want to make sure I was understanding what you were saying about Mexico. And first was, how do we know how many German Jewish or Jewish refugees from Europe they ended up taking?
Mexico, it's not clear because some of them didn't write that they were Jewish. They put themselves down as going as Spanish Republicans. I know there was at least 20,000. And they, and here, I'll write the names of the...
I'll write them in, that's fine.
Oh, yeah, I've got it right here.
Oh, okay.
And then...
Dominican Haven?
Yes. So, Mexico, because there wasn't a particular project, now there were other efforts to bring refugees to Mexico. There was, in northern Mexico, there was a project like SOSUA that failed, but it did bring in a couple of hundred Jewish refugees to Mexico, even though it didn't have the success that SOSUA ultimately had as far as maintaining the land. And SOSUA today is still active, not necessarily, of course, with the Jewish community, but with the local community.
I thought I had read, and perhaps I'm mistaken, that at the same time or around the same time as the St. Louis is turned away from Cuba, that there are ships going to Mexico that are turned away from Mexico. But
Yeah,
later
so-
on, they open their doors. So is there a time frame that's important to recognize, or is there some issue that changes the mind in Mexico?
Well, when you look at the different, when you look at the ships, they have each of them a different story. A lot of it depended on timing, I should say, the chronology. Yes, the boat, the Kwanzaa, and I have a picture of the Kwanzaa in the opening slide. The Kwanzaa was a boat that took refugees to Veracruz but many of them were denied entry. And the Kwanzaa came up to New York to refuel before it went, and to also, there were other refugees on the boat who were disembarking in New York. The Kwanzaa goes to Richmond, Virginia. And at this time, it's September 1940. War has already begun. When the St. Louis occurred, when the voyage of the St. Louis occurred, the war had not yet started. So there are very different circumstances. And ultimately, the refugees on the Kwanzaa who had been denied refuge in Mexico were allowed to stay here in the United States. But there were 3 other boats actually that went to Cuba and arrived in Cuba the same day as the St. Louis. They were also turned away. But we hear about the St. Louis because it came here to the US. But I just want to also make clear that the St. Louis and the Kwanzaa were not typical stories. Over 100,000 Jewish refugees were able to come to the United States in New York, to enter through New York between 1938 and 1941. That's not looking at refugees who came through Florida, who came through Texas, through California, through Arizona, which they did. But in New York City alone, over 100,000 Jewish refugees arrived in a 3-year time span. So the St. Louis was not your typical story. It's been used, and I think people have this belief that the St. Louis was the one boat that ever came and we turned it away, and that's not true. It is a tragic story nonetheless, but it was not the typical story of boats coming up.
But we did have quotas and restrictions that
absolutely.
everybody had to have their paperwork in order before they were coming to New York.
And that was a very difficult process, and very difficult to obtain the paperwork. And it was very difficult to obtain the paperwork when you look at many of the Latin American countries too. Argentina had and still has the 5th largest Jewish community in the world, and at that time too. But it closed its doors too, as well. And it was one of the more active communities.
Well, Christina, I honestly have many more questions, but I think we should let you go and let our visitors go as well. I want to thank you very much for coming and sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us, and for giving us such an interesting presentation, and for being our lead-off batter for our programming for National Hispanic Heritage Month.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, and good luck to everyone. And I hope that when our museum opens and you happen to be in Washington, D.C., please come to visit us. And thank you, Dr. Tritter, and thank you to everyone, and to Helen Turner. And we hope to work with you again.
Outstanding. Thanks very much, and have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.